Welcome to the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, a podcast for business owners sharing the latest news and tips about customs clearance and freight forwarding. Welcome to episode 18 of the Platinum Freight Podcast with Peter McRae, Customs Broker. And today we're discussing passenger hand carry clearance to New Zealand. So, Peter, let's start with an overview. What is passenger hand carry clearance and why is it important for importers bringing goods into New Zealand?
Passenger clearances or passenger airport clearances are concerned about where either individuals or individuals that work for businesses will bring items to New Zealand and they'll actually have the goods in their checked-in luggage or in their backpack, for example. So in New Zealand, we have 4 international terminals. So if the individual is flying into Auckland or Wellington or Christchurch or Queenstown, these individuals, these passengers need to fill in a New Zealand declaration for when they arrive, an immigration declaration. There's a section on the green immigration card or on the New Zealand Declaration app where it asks, are you bringing any commercial or business goods to New Zealand? So when the passenger selects that box or circle and places a tick, then the goods will be detained at the airport and the New Zealand Customs Service will give the passenger a form which is a NZCS 315 receipt for detained goods. And the reason why the New Zealand Customs Service officer is giving this form is that the goods will need a customs broker to process a customs clearance to work out if the goods need to pay any import duty and then calculate the import GST and then charge an import processing charge of $81.25. So passenger clearances is just another way that goods enter New Zealand. Just a thought to think about is if a passenger arrives into Auckland and then has a connecting flight to a domestic airport, and if the goods are detained at one of these 4 international terminals, then the passenger either continues on with the domestic flight or amends that domestic flight until the goods have been released, and then they go back to the airport, pick up the goods, and then take the goods with them to their next destination. So that's an important issue to think about, but I guess the recommendation is if any New Zealand business or any New Zealand individual plans to bring items to New Zealand which are business or commercial goods, then they should speak with a customs broker early. And when I say early, I mean days in advance before that person even boards the plane to New Zealand.
And what types of goods do passengers typically hand carry to New Zealand? And in what situations would an importer require a passenger hand carry clearance?
So we see different scenarios, and some of the scenarios could be a representative from a New Zealand business has been to a trade fair overseas, has purchased stock or items, and is now bringing these items with them on the plane back to New Zealand. So these items are going to be, for example, less than 60 kilograms. They're not going to be hundreds of kilograms. They might be 5 kilograms, 10 kilograms, 20 kilograms. Some people might travel overseas and bring back jewelry for their jewelry shop. Some people might be bringing technical or testing equipment. So, no matter what the goods are, if the goods are for business or for commercial purposes, then the goods will need to pay tax. And the reason that these goods need to pay tax is even if these goods had arrived into New Zealand with the postal system, or if these goods had arrived with DHL or FedEx, and if the goods were 5, 10, 15, 20 kilograms, they would still need to have the import duty tax assessment, the import GST tax assessment, and the $81.25 import processing charge. So I guess what I'm trying to explain is that no matter how the goods arrive into the country, there will be a tax assessment, but when the goods come as hand carry passenger hand carry goods, then it needs to be processed well in advance, because there's nothing worse than having the goods detained at the airport and then having to go back to the airport to pick up the goods possibly days later. And sometimes when people do bring goods into the country, I hear the phrase, "I'm only here for 5 days and I need these goods for a project, or I need these goods to be used for a short time, and then I'm then flying back out of the country." So by the time we do the clearance, there may not be enough time for that person to be able to use those goods. I guess the secret is the sooner that you know that you're going to bring commercial or business goods to the country, then reach out to a customs broker like us, and then we can do that clearance before you or your representative boards the plane for New Zealand. You'll have paperwork to print. You would then print that paperwork before you board the plane, and then you could then present that paperwork to the New Zealand customs officer at one of the 4 international terminals, and then the New Zealand Customs Service officer will then allow you to leave the airport with the goods. So that scenario is much better and smoother than having to amend your flights or return to the airport days later to collect the goods.
So, how much notice should an importer provide to Platinum to arrange a passenger hand carry clearance?
So we would recommend at least 5 business days notice, because if the importer has never imported to New Zealand before, we have to apply for a New Zealand Customs Service importer code for that individual or for that business. And that process could be as little as 10 minutes, or it could take days. If the business has never imported to New Zealand before, and if they have more than one director for that business, then it's a requirement that every director of that business provides clear, legible photo identification to enable the importer code to be created and established. So if it's a large New Zealand business who is importing for the first time, and if they have, for example, 5 or 10 directors of the business, then we need to receive 5 or 10 clear, legible photo identification pieces from the directors to allow this importer code to be created. So that's one delay, one hiccup. Then we need to then submit the clearance, and we need to receive a clear status we need to receive a release status from two government departments. We need to receive a release status from the New Zealand Customs Service, and then we need a release status from the Ministry for Primary Industries. So we need this release, and then once we have this release, we can then email the individual or the business representative, and we can provide them with the release papers so that they can print this paperwork at the hotel or at the airport before they depart for New Zealand.
And so, what are the potential consequences if an importer does not have a passenger hand carry clearance before arriving in New Zealand?
What will happen is once the individual presents himself to the New Zealand Customs Service officer, they will then detain the goods and then provide the individual with the receipt for detained goods, which is a New Zealand Customs Form 315. And then the importer then needs to go and source a customs broker to clear the goods. And as I mentioned, if they've never imported before, they'll have to wait for their importer code to be processed. Then they need to return to the airport to collect the goods. So it will then add, let's say, at least another 3 days, maybe 2 to 3 days before the person can pick up the goods from the airport.
And can you share the details of the case where an Australian passenger arrived at Wellington, had an item detained by the NZCS, and how the clearance process allowed the item to travel on to Nelson?
We had a customer who flew from Melbourne into Wellington with a connecting flight to Nelson, and the individual was bringing items into New Zealand just for a short time, let's just say up to 2 weeks. And then they contacted us after they had arrived at Wellington and advised us of the situation. And then we processed the customs clearance, but we did have to apply for a importer code, which took a good part of a day just to receive the importer code. Then we submitted the declaration. There was tax to pay. The importer paid us for our services, but the disadvantage of doing a passenger clearance after the person and the goods arrive into New Zealand is that the passenger flew on to Nelson and the package was detained in Wellington. So the passenger needed to contact the airline where the goods were being held, and then they made arrangements to place the goods onto a flight to send the goods from Wellington to Nelson.
And can you discuss the case of a New Zealand passenger bringing items to Queenstown from Australia, where goods were detained by the NZCS, and how the clearance process was resolved?
So we had a importer, a New Zealand resident, who had been to Australia and had purchased some items and then flew into Queenstown and answered the New Zealand immigration arrival card, and then the goods were detained. The importer received the NZCS 315, and then the importer reached out to us and asked us to assist them with clearing the goods. The goods were then duty assessed, GST assessed, and then had a $81.25 import processing charge levied on the customs entry. And then once we had processed and finalized the customs entry, the importer was able to go back to Queenstown Airport and collect the goods that they had brought in from Australia.
Now, what is the NZCS 315 receipt for detained goods, and how does it play a role in the passenger hand carry clearance process?
So the NZCS 315 form, receipt for detained goods, is the form that the New Zealand Customs Service officer will give to the passenger when the goods are being detained at the airport. And then it has a unique number, and we rely on that unique number when we do the customs entry to show that those goods have been entered, processed, and tax has been paid, so that when we receive the release paperwork, the unique number is listed on the paperwork, and the NZCS knows that the goods are available and ready to be collected and taken away from the airport.
And how does Platinum coordinate the New Zealand Customs Clearance Service to facilitate passenger hand carry clearances, and what are the key steps involved?
So we process these passenger clearances frequently, and we know that days evaporate and that some people are in different time zones when they are contacting us to receive a clearance, and that there could be multiple people involved. So we might have somebody from the New Zealand office, then we might have the representative who is in another time zone. And while the communication is happening, we need to be applying for the New Zealand importer code. We need to be aware of when that person is going to board the flight to come to New Zealand. We need to make certain that we receive payment before we can provide the release paperwork. So it is a time sensitive process, and the earlier that we know that this shipment may or will occur allows us to then put the steps in place to make it happen. And we know that the best result is that the person is able to leave the airport with the goods in their possession. We know that the least favorable option is when the passenger needs to amend their domestic booking to stay close to one of the four international terminals until the passenger clearance has been completed, and then return to the airport to collect the goods, then board the domestic flight with the goods in their possession.
And finally, can you share some tips or best practices for importers to ensure a smooth process when dealing with passenger hand carry clearances, including preparation and documentation?
So I guess the key is early consideration, early planning, reaching out to someone like us to discuss the issue. And the more time that we receive, the smoother the process will be. But ultimately, we would need the e-ticket for the passenger that is going to bring the goods to the country. We would need the commercial invoice for the goods, and we would need the current issued New Zealand Customs Service importer code. And if there is no importer code already in place, then that would be the first thing that we would be doing, is to apply for that importer code, which will allow us to create an import declaration for the importer. But when you reflect on this particular podcast, I think the key piece of information that is coming through is that the more notice that the customs broker receives, which will allow the whole process to go smoothly and without any hiccups or delays or missed timelines.
Thanks for sharing your insights and tips, Peter. Now, to learn more about customs clearance and freight management services, visit platinumfreight.co.nz.